A woman is cooking at home outside the door. A masked assailant is killing the woman's neighbor. The neighbor is pinned against the glass door, desperately calling for help, but Maddie continues to work as if she didn't hear her. The murderer is very curious about the woman, so the thug makes a lot of noise. He wanted to get Maddie's attention, but until the neighbor was completely dead, Maddie didn't turn around. The thug was confused. He looked at Maddie's back in disbelief, and he couldn't resist tapping his fingertips on the glass. He wanted Maddie to notice his presence. Then the thug switched to pounding his fist on the glass door, but Maddie still didn't find him. The thug felt very angry. He surveyed his surroundings. He decided to teach Maddie a lesson. Soon the thug slipped into Maddie's house. He quietly walked up behind Maddie and pulled out a dagger, but that's when Maddie's friend Sarah called on the video. The killer immediately hid to keep Maddie from noticing. He saw Maddie communicating in sign language. The murderer realized that Maddie was deaf and mute, so he secretly took Maddie's phone, but Sarah noticed that something was wrong. Sarah warned Maddie that there was someone behind her, but Maddie didn't care. She said it was probably the family cat rummaging for food. However, Maddie just got up and went to feed the cat. When she turned on her computer again, she received multiple messages. They were all from her own phone. Maddie clicked on the messages in confusion. She was horrified to find that it was a picture of herself in her room. She instantly felt very horrible, but what was even more horrifying was the last picture. Maddie was now on the couch. Maddie was stunned. Her eyes were wide with fear and she was afraid to move. Maddie gasped for air and tried to look back. She looked at the empty doorway. She stood up trembling and approached the door carefully. She saw a man in a mask standing outside the door, and the man was staring at her with a deadly stare. Late at night, the deaf woman was horrified to find the masked man standing outside her door. The man was holding her cell phone in his hand. The man's appearance was also very strange. Maddie was terrified. She quickly rushed to the door and locked it, but the murderer did not care and went to the next door. Maddie rushed over and locked the door again. The murderer saw all the doors locked by Maddie. He angrily jiggled the handle and stared at Maddie coldly. The murderer then turns around and walks backwards. Maddie watched the murderer's every move nervously. She was afraid the murderer might break in and hurt her at any moment. Maddie took advantage of the fact that the murderer kept wandering outside the house. Maddie rushed to the computer and prepared to call the police, but the house went dark instantly. Wi-Fi was also disconnected. Maddie's eyes were wide with fear. She didn't know how to get in touch with the outside world. Maddie looked up in horror. She saw the murderer standing outside the window, staring at her strangely. The murderer had drawn a blood mark on the glass. Maddie panicked and didn't know what to do. She watched as murderer used a dagger to poke all the tires of the car. This completely interrupted her thoughts of escape. Maddie burst into tears of despair. She stood there and turned around for a while. She came up with a solution. Maddie opened her bag and took out a lipstick. She then took the flashlight out of the cupboard. Then she walked uneasily to the door again. Maddie looked carefully at the location of the murderer. Then she picked up the lipstick and wrote a message on the glass. She sat her day nervously and turned on the flashlight in her hand. She wanted to draw the murderer to her. Sure enough, it followed the light and came over. Maddie was so scared that she was shaking. The murderer saw Maddie write on the glass, "I didn't see your face. I won't call the police. Can you let me go?" But the murderer suddenly stood up. He took off his hat straight away. As he looked at Maddie, he unzipped his mask.
You've seen it now, haven't you? I can get you anytime I want.
They saw that the murderer weren't going to let her go. She went to the kitchen and grabbed a kitchen knife in order to survive. She then took out the sledgehammer and held it tightly in her hand. With a defensive weapon in her hand, Maddie had a little more courage to fight back. Then she went back to her bedroom and locked the door behind her. Maddie made sure the murderer wasn't nearby. She pushed the cabinet to block the door. Maddie then closed all the curtains. Finally, she leans against the wall and holds her weapon in both hands. Maddie waited for the murderer, who would break in at any moment. Then a dark shadow suddenly appeared on the wall. Maddie clung to the wall in fear. She held her breath and didn't dare to make any sound. Maddie looked nervously at the window. She found the neighbor banging on the glass. Maddie immediately stood up. She thought she was going to be saved. Instead, Maddie saw the murderer manipulating the neighbor's body. Maddie was stunned. She dropped the hammer and stepped back. Then she pushed open the cabinet and pulled the door open and ran out of the room. Then she snuck outside. Maddie tried to escape in the dark. However, when the murderer couldn't find Maddie, he started wandering around the house. Maddie hid at the bottom of the stairs and watched him. She put her hand under the board above her head. Maddie wanted to use her sense of touch to determine the location of the murderer, but Maddie couldn't have imagined the murderer stopped right above her. Maddie looked up in fear. She hurriedly covered her mouth not to make a sound, but this subtle movement was still detected by the murderer. On the dark roof of the house, the woman covered the flashlight and did not dare to show the light. Then, she raised the flashlight above her head again. She threw the flashlight towards the distant woods. The light immediately attracted the attention of the killer downstairs. Maddie saw that the killer had been successfully tricked. She hurried along the eaves of the house and crept to the ladder. Maddie had barely taken a step. A crossbow bolt pierced her thigh. Maddie couldn't bear the pain, but before she could react, the killer downstairs was loading a second crossbow bolt. Maddie scrambled back up to the roof. As soon as she peeks out, a crossbow bolt flew right past her scalp. The killer still doesn't give her a chance to catch her breath. He climbs the ladder and prepares to kill Maddie, but Maddie didn't want to give up either. She fought through the pain and pulled the crossbow from her leg. Then she quietly got up and crouched in place. The moment the killer climbed up, Maddie grabbed his crossbow and punched him straight in the face. She successfully knocked the killer back. Maddie hurriedly took out her crossbow and tried to shoot the killer, but she didn't know how to use it. Maddie watched as the killer climbed up again. She had to run back to her room, dragging her injured leg. Maddie closed the window just as the killer arrived. For a long time, the two of them were locked in a standoff through the glass, but Maddie knew her injuries needed to be treated, so she went to the bathroom and struggled to take off her pants. All she could do was bite down on a strip of cloth. Then she poured alcohol on the wound to disinfect it. The pain was so intense that she kept tapping on the floor. Maddie then used the cloth to tie the wound securely to stop the bleeding. To protect herself, she began to study how to use the killer's crossbow. But Maddie's injuries were so severe, she couldn't get the crossbow to load. But just when Maddie was feeling desperate, John suddenly came to Maddie's house. He was surprised to see the words on the glass asking for help. At that moment, the killer came up posing as a police officer. He also accused John of being a suspicious person. John believed the killer's words. He handed over his ID and cell phone, but the blood on the killer's arm combined with the writing on the glass. John realized that this man was not a police officer at all. So John grabbed a rock when the killer wasn't looking. John wanted to sneak up behind the killer and attack him, but John was just about to do it. Maddie suddenly appeared at the door. She frantically rapped on the door and asked John for help. The killer realized he couldn't fool John. He stabbed John directly through the carotid artery. Seeing John killed by the murderer, Maddie's whole body was stunned. Her only hope was destroyed by herself. Angry, Maddie grabbed her crossbow again. She shot an arrow directly at the killer, but she missed and the killer didn't die. The killer pulled out the crossbow and rushed forward desperately. Maddie started to run straight away, but the last arrow fell to the ground. Maddie tried to reach out and pick it up. Instead, her arm was clamped shut by the killer. Maddie was in unbearable pain, but the killer continued to raise his foot and kick down directly. But it didn't end there. He stepped directly on Maddie's hand until Maddie's fingers were completely deformed. He let go of his foot. Maddie rushed to lock the door, but the killer looked at Maddie. Then he broke the crossbow on the ground and said flatly, "You're going to die." But what the killer didn't expect was that Maddie wasn't the same as before. She didn't have the cowardly expression she had before. Her eyes had become very fierce. Maddie dabbed some blood on the wound with her finger. Then she wrote a line on the glass. She was going to fight the killer to the death. The killer laughed at Maddie's actions. He looked at Maddie quietly and left. Maddie knew that he was going to find tools to force his way into the room. So Maddie went back to the bathroom and sat her day on the floor with her back against the tub. She stared ahead with the knife raised. Angrily, she waited for the killer who would come in at any moment. Maddie, who was deaf and mute, didn't know that the killer had broken the window and snuck in. The killer was now hiding behind Maddie. The killer pulls out his pocket knife. He taunts Maddie, who can't hear, with words. However, the killer's exhaled breath already made Maddie aware of the location. Just as the killer pulls out the knife, Maddie reversed her wrist. At the same time, she sidestepped and stepped backwards. She successfully dodged the killer's knife and killed him in return. At the end, Maddie sat her day in the doorway, unable to tone down.